Okay, welcome, friends. My name is Ian McKenzie, and I am the co-producer, co-host of the forthcoming event, Fugitive Futures, a 5-day gathering of wisdom keepers, luminaries, talks, workshops, all around this theme of navigating these uncertain times. And as part of our approach to this gathering together, we've invited certain guests to come on and begin to approach a lot of these themes that we're going to be touching on in a good way. Last week, I spoke with the storyteller Martin Shaw as we spoke about trailing beauty. And now we're going to speak with my two guests. And these two I had the great esteem of, one I've known for many, many years and have been awestruck to call my teacher. And I've been able to spend many years both, not many years on the road, but many times on the road, as well as on the farm and in Ontario on the shores of Golden Lake. And the other guest I've actually met in the first time in person, but have been appreciating from afar in many ways, the ways in which these two have really given their co-labors towards also a kind of crafting beauty from these times. And so I'm going to read a little bit about the two of them and then invite them on. And we'll join as we enter into this conversation on matrimony as in service to cultural regeneration. And so I'd love to introduce to you Stephen Jenkinson. Stephen is a worker, author, storyteller, culture activist, and co-founder of the Orphan Wisdom School with his wife, Natalie Roy. And the school is and has been a teaching house for skills of deep living, making human culture that are mandatory in endangering times. He makes books. He writes them, in fact, Tens Farm and Men's Broken Handles and Fences, and succumbs to interviews like this one, teaches and performs internationally. That Stephen Jenkinson will be on in a moment, and he'll be joined shoulder to shoulder with Kimberly Ann Johnson. And Kimberly Johnson is an author, postpartum care activist, trauma educator, structural body worker, and single mother. She graduated valedictorian, my goodness, from Northwestern University. She studied yoga with 3 main lineage holders of the Krishnamacharya, I want to say that right, tradition. I think maybe you can help with this part with Iyengar, Batabi Joyce, and taught yoga full-time for 15 years while running a structural integration practice. My goodness. They are both the co-authors as well of a book, Generations Worth, which we're going to touch on in a second. But I want to welcome to you, Stephen and Kimberly.
Ian, or Smooth Tone, as I like to think of you. Good to see you again, man.
I was waiting for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want you to wait long.
Well, once again, thank you for joining us on this talk on the approach to fugitive futures, shoulder to shoulder, I believe in San Diego. Is that where you are? Yeah. And Steve, we were just chatting a bit beforehand. And again, the time I saw you both last was on the farm on Golden Lake. And I was part of a cohort that came together to, I would say, be in the etiquette of endings and the proper etiquette of endings. I mean, I think the whole gathering was called a handful of endings because, of course, the school itself, as we've known it, needed to be ended. And there's reasons for that. And I might maybe turn it to you just to speak a little bit about why and how you doing? How you doing now?
Huh. Well, I miss the school. But I've been missing the school for a while now. So that wasn't new, you know. I miss the kind of daring do of the enterprise, you know, and the ability and the willingness of people who come to take things on that are not immediately promising or profitable. And I felt I was in good company over the years, for the most part, you know, with a few flagrant exceptions, but mostly it was it wasn't predicated on everybody being in the same groove. It was predicated on people's willingness to think unwarranted thoughts and consider danger and then reconsider it again and to up the ante on what it means to be a citizen of a troubled time. So how could you not miss that? And you can walk around knowing that the people are out there, which I do, but it's not the same. Let's be clear. It's just not the same as the convening and the outrage that you turn to from time to time. And so, yeah, we had to find a way to give it its resting place. So, with your help and the help of the 100 or so people that came, we very reluctantly put that down. When you reluctantly retire something, it's not really retired because it feels the gravitational pull of not quite yet or not, or does it have to be this way, or isn't there another iteration? And of course, I've been approached a good number of times just before that last year and through the balance of the year to reconsider endings. I mean, if I can pronounce an ending, surely there doesn't have to be one. That seems to be the rationale. But I'd rather preside over something than be interred. Like if I had a choice, which at the moment I still have a choice. So I did want to oversee, not control really, but make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's were crossed about what was possible and likely. So there wasn't a lot of lingering hankering after people's sort of the most beautiful thoughts they had about me, and leave them to that. I mean, that was the general idea of what happened in the fall. And then, I had a few things I had to take care of, project-wise, writing project-wise, which I wasn't going to do if I had a kind of open running gag called "Not Quite Yet" or "Not quite finished," or so then you arbitrarily decide that you're done, leaving open the possibility that you could be wrong. But you'd rather be wrong that way than think you're not done and in a drastic way discover that you are.
Steve, you said something one time, which was essentially like you tend to not know the last time of anything until after it's the last time.
Right.
And yet maybe there's a way that you can know it's the last time and proceed accordingly. Or maybe a certain kind of last. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to decide. And the thing's so counterintuitive, isn't it? It's a lot like the ending of a relationship, that you can either count on the symptoms annihilating the thing for you. You could do that. And people stumble along wondering what's the status of things, and everybody knows what that feels like. Or you can, with a clarity of mind that you don't really seek, you can find a way to pronounce its ending, to call it to an end, rather than like a broadcaster or some kind of news wonk breathlessly report on the incipient details. You could just say, let's conduct ourselves as if we don't get to do this again. And that's a good throwdown for anybody who's literate and cognizant of the troubles of the times, I think. Yeah.
Well, I understand you've been working on a book since then as well, which Kimberly, I think, was one of the instigators to say, come on now, you gotta get it complete or dust it off or something. And I'd love to hear that, because what is it about? I mean, I have the title here. I don't want to spoil it yet, but because it relates to the theme of the talk. Of course, matrimony is a path to cultural regeneration. But I wonder, Kimberly, if you might speak a little to what you felt was necessary to get out there.
Yeah. So I just heard rumblings that there was a book and it was called Matrimony. And I was getting married. Also, I poured over the earlier books that Stephen had written. So I was really eager to read it just as its own piece of work. And so I asked for it at a certain point and read through it. And I think when you've left something for a while, it's hard to know how it was, you don't exactly even when you're writing a book, at least for me, I don't know everything that's in it as I'm writing it. So if you've already finished it and you've moved on and written other books, because Stephen wrote Generations Worth on his own, but we wrote a book together called Reckoning. And so we'd done other projects since then, and he'd done his own other projects. So once I read it, I was really enthusiastic about finding a publisher. Stephen has self-published his last two books. And so I was really convicted about finding a publishing house for it. And then in between that process, Stephen got a diagnosis. And so that diagnosis was kind of everything's different now. What's really important? Does this book make it to the top of a priority list? Is it possible to do this? Is it wise to do it? If there's only so much time and energy, where should that go? And so I really made the bid that it was close enough that even though, yes, there was more work to do, that the bulk of it was finished and that I really wanted the world to have it.
Right. So, you know, the prompting that comes along with that, to be on the receiving end of that kind of generous concern, is that you have to ask yourself, is there a book there? And that's different from, did you write down everything you could think of? You know, it's a book is a different entity. It's a life form. You know, I think if you do it well, and sometimes you can't tell, you can't find the pulse. You can see the body outline under the sheet, so to speak, especially if you've left it for a while, which I did. But you don't know if there's anything to revive. Was the exercise of doing it its own, I don't know, reward or purpose or what have you? And then, you know, you have to go about these things as if somebody who knows better than you the possible merits that you've been up to is onto something. And it's unnerving. It's not automatically uplifting. At least it wasn't for me, because I had to reconsider my criteria. You know, and if your name's going to be on the front and you're not sure that you've pulled it off, the question becomes, where else would you go if you take the sheet down off the body? And the truth was, given the diagnosis and so on, things had moved, you know, priority-wise, things had really moved. But I didn't know to where yet, because I didn't know how to be a diagnosed guy. I genuinely didn't know. And the translation of being a reasonably able-bodied citizen to being a diagnosed guy is not a shift of a couple of degrees, right? It's a different order of claim that rests upon you. And if you have any kind of a public, if you're a public apparition in any way, which I've been from time to time in a fitful fashion, then you realize at some point that you do have some at least nominal responsibility to be to translate as you've been doing. And you decide whether or not you're the subject of the translation, which I've never been a fan of autobiography, really. I don't find it that useful. You know, you live it once, no sense reliving it over and over again as a story, right? But the Matrimony book passed through the filter or the kind of X-ray machine of, is this what I should be doing now with what I presume is the optimal energy and give a shit available to me? And you can see the answer finally was yes. And I just went on faith that Kim was onto something and that she knew what she was talking about.
Well, I understand the title is, if I could reveal, Matrimony, Ritual. Oh, the book is Matrimony. And the subtitle, which you've submitted to apparently, is Ritual, Culture, and the Heart's Work.
Right.
And I, just to tip off the listeners or the viewers here, I've been on a few weddings that Stephen has orchestrated. And it has been, it completely undid what I thought a wedding was, what its function was, how it's supposed to go. And I'm still in many ways undone by it. And once you see it, that way, you can't unsee it. And so this conversation, I think there's a couple of foundational stones to understand what we mean when we say, how could matrimony be a path towards cultural regeneration? And so I think perhaps the first one might say, or might ask is, what is culture from an understanding that is helpful for this conversation?
Can I just say something
Please.
first?
Please.
So I just wanted to say, besides, like, so why, but yeah, okay, I was getting married, and so when you're about to get married, especially not in your 20s, not in your first marriage, and also teaching as I do about female empowerment, a lot of people are like, well, why would you get married? Why would you do that? Like, what's the point? Even some people were disappointed, like, I'm disappointed in you that you were going to do this. And in this particular case, and we'll talk about what is matrimony, what is culture, because matrimony is not a common word. The reason that I was so convicted about this book, in addition to the fact that most of it was already written, and I think that if you know that your time is limited, there's maybe loops that you want to close, loops that you want to leave open. But besides that, in this case, for me, matrimony and this book specifically is an occasion to talk about a lot of the biggest issues, let's say that word, of this time. So questions about gender, questions about gender roles, questions about what is love, what is romance, is tradition valuable at all? Is matrimony or marriage just something that's always been prejudicial against women from the beginning of time, and so therefore it needs to be completely cast aside? And then being asked by certain people without religion, which is a great number of people at this time, spiritually disenfranchised, or the I'm spiritual, not religious kind of thing. Then when it comes time for this event that everybody wants to have great meaning, they're hoping that it has meaning, and then you go, like a lot of occasions, and you just leave feeling flat. You leave feeling like, wow, something could have happened but didn't. Or I thought I was waiting for such and like, I was waiting for the toast, I was waiting for the big speech, I was waiting for something meaningful to happen. We come to these thresholds, and it's a sort of do it yourself, whatever you call it, when you go to like Vegas and it's an all you can eat bar. I forgot what that's called.
All inclusive kind of thing?
No, when you have
Open bar?
not like a buffet, but like
Oh,
basically you've got all the choices in the world, and then your plate just becomes a mix and match. And that's where a lot of us are left, because I found myself Googling wedding rings because I'm wondering, well, what are wedding rings all about? Google vows, and it's not a good time to start that inquiry when you're about to get married, even if you have a year. That's not, you can't learn enough in a year to then make choices and implement them. And so this book, to me, Die Wise is about Stephen's time with death and dying people. Come of Age is about elderhood. Generations worth went through different topics at different times. But this is really using matrimony as cultural refraction. So it's a way to see kinship. How if matrimony, and there's two sides of the aisle, and there's all these little hints of things, bachelorette parties, that once you're in them, you have a sense like, oh, this used to mean something. This used to be done, but now it's become, here we are in Vegas. I don't know why Vegas, well, weddings, Vegas, like here we are in Vegas again, but what are all these little fragments, and why do they matter? And why at a time when so many people are willing to say, let's just do away with everything that came before us because it doesn't work. Like if it worked, look, how would we be where we are with climate change? How would we be where we are with the divorce rates? How would we, looking from many different lenses about a cultural function that matrimony used to serve. And so to me, as somebody that was getting married, but also just somebody interested in culture making and looking at different moments in a person's life where culture can happen, and then having my own wedding kind of prove that to me. That's why I'm so compelled about this book. And I think people are going to be so surprised, because most people will read it thinking that they're a ceremonialist, or they're specifically interested in that. But what we found when we took it to the publisher was that there was people of all different ages and identities that found themselves really compelled by the book, surprisingly so, given what they imagined that it would be, because they put it in the category of traditionalism. They put it in the category of like, oh, white guy with a long beard who is now wearing a puffy jacket, but generally doesn't wear neoprene or, synthetic fabrics. They didn't realize the enormity of. It's sort of ironic, because we put so much on marriage and couples in the nuclear family, but at the same time, in this sense, we're putting something else on the dynamic that has much more refractive capability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mind, Steve, before we turn it over to you, actually, there's the line in Generations Worth that I think kind of speaks to what Kimberly's saying. And then I might be a good way to, enter in. So, and this links actually to the Diewise, your time with Diewise. So this is Stephen's book, Generations Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. But on the chapter in Matrimony, you write, there's a bracing thought. Matrimony is a lot like death. I'll just leave it there. No, just kidding. There's something that matrimony is a lot like death. Not many people, even then, right? People are like, what? It would be enough. But you say, as a working deity, it has nothing to do with and no regard for those marzipan effigies on a wedding cake. From what I've seen in my brief but downright careen through the hallways and archways of life's mansion, it's far from clear that we are benefiting from putting aside the doing of matrimony. Young people wonder out loud with me about whether matrimony can be redeemed enough for them to admit into their romantic lives. I don't think that this is the dilemma before them, before the rest of us. With some humility on the matter and with some residual theistic soulfulness, we could instead consider that we are setting aside some kind of spirit adeptness when we set aside matrimony. And the time may come when we may be unable to learn its subtle ways, particularly its village-making ways, for want of a living example. So I just thought I'd add that on what you're saying, Kimberly and Steve. Yeah, I wonder, over to you.
It's pretty good, no?
So that's real good.
So I'd read that. Well, this is going to sound maybe uncalled for, but not everything's changed. I still have some uncalled for things up my sleeve. I was a student of historical Christianity at a certain period in my life. And that was a prelude, or that was the second best to me wanting to get led into the hallowed halls of some kind of clergydom, which never happened, or it happened and nobody told me. And one of the things I discovered, I believe, is that the chagrin and worse that's piled at the feet of Christianity, organized and otherwise, is we all know it's, quote, understandable, and that it has its place, and that it is in many respects called for. And there's only one caveat I would introduce to that piling up, and that would be that we're probably not talking about Christianity when we're talking about the slings and arrows, the outrages, and all the rest that are attributed to it. We're talking about this worldly religiosity that lost its way and ceased to be traceable back to that from which Christianity arises, which is a fairly simple and not that complicated either reading of life that's available through certain kind of pronouncements that the Jesus character is alleged to have made. I'm saying the same thing in this book about matrimony. With all of the harm and harshness that's laid at matrimony's feet, it's not matrimony's doing. It's the failings that we've it's the feelings that, it's the failures that we've made of matrimony, not matrimony's way of failing us. That's what I'm trying to say. So I did a book that wondered about our capacity for matrimony, not matrimony's capacity to soothe us.
Mm.
And you can tell I put the emphasis in a certain way that we have a responsibility to fundamental social institutions. That's my understanding of part of the reckoning of the conditions of citizenship. I don't mean to a political entity now. When I say citizenship, I mean a kind of spirit kinship with an endeavor that humans are absolutely capable of, but at least in the Western iteration, routinely seem to set aside. So it's a throwdown. The book about matrimony is a throwdown. For sure it is. And I wanted to call it the Bone House of Love. That was and I'm still calling it that to myself. And the phrase bone house, which the publisher properly understood to be ultimately confusing and off-throwing. Is that a word? I've never said off-throwing before. Anyway, you'll know what it is.
Off-putting, off-throwing.
Yeah. It's a literal transliteration of the old Anglo-Saxon word for body, B-O-D-Y. And so bone house is where the bone house of love is the place where love gets to appear in the world. And that's my fundamental contention about matrimony is it's not a clearinghouse. It's a kind of translation on the hoof of people's feelings for each other into something that the world desperately needs to see and to be adorned with and to be educated by.
Mm.
We've talked before about how each of us, I've been in births where birth doesn't happen. And Stephen's been in deaths where death doesn't occur. And I think what we've all been a part of is marriages where matrimony doesn't occur. So when Stephen's saying right now, it's not what matrimony hasn't done for us. It's like, what is the state of our own lack of culturedness that we bring to the altar of these thresholds that are meant to remake us or make us more human, but we don't have the skill for it. We haven't been developing ourselves to arrive at that time, either as a participant or as not just the two people that are getting married, but the people that are arriving there. Everyone is responsible for that event to conjure matrimony,
right,
as well as the ceremonialist. But so I really experienced this matrimony as like death at my own wedding. I was counseled, I had been on the farm prior, and I was counseled to treat the time coming up to the ceremony as my 9th month of pregnancy because I had been pregnant before. So as I left the farm, that was the blessing I received, is allow yourself to go into this liminal space, allow yourself to be transformed, transmuted, allow yourself to be available for what may happen or could happen. And I understood, because I got married in Brazil and I was in a very different culture than my own, that understands a matrimony as a cultural event, so much so that a third of the people that came, I or my husband had never met. They were just people that took care of the place where we were getting married. And a feeling of, I really understood in a visceral way why the father walks you down the aisle. because it really felt in a visceral way that I was getting torn away, even though I'm already financially independent for a really long time and I've lived on my own, and I'm not hyper connected to my parents in a specific kind of way, but it really did feel like I was getting torn away from my own dad and given to my husband in an archetypal way that I could never rationally explain or maybe even rationally want to submit to. So I also realized that if we don't have something like matrimony, when we get to death, there's a huge pileup because the marriage was an occasion for my husband's 4 brothers to be together, and they hadn't been together for 7 years. And it was an occasion for my husband's mothers to see their sons together and to have talks and to have space and time to catch up, which if we didn't have that, just simply wouldn't have happened. And I don't know the next time that it will happen. So without these cultural moments to magnetize or coalesce or to give us the occasion to arrive there and allow something to happen together, we become impoverished at these other thresholds of birth and death and probably other really important rites of passage moments. Puberty.
Thanks for that. I have a quote here too as well. And what I want to do is just make a link, which is, it's fascinating for me as well, because having spent a number of years making a film about a community in Portugal called Tamera, and a lot of the folks here who've also seen the film, there's actually very interesting parallels between both being in service to an understanding of the village and what it takes to actually, in a way, mediate, right, between these forces. And you actually have a beautiful line here, Steve. And I think this also can help ground it for some folks who may be curious about the connection, which is that you say mediation is mandatory for making a go of conjugal love. You need the world between you and your beloved to do the heavy lifting of translating your love and your longing for a better day into something a sorrowed world could use, something a sorrowing heart could do. And that's what matrimony's for. Matrimony gives your love its spirit work. It plants community between you so that the village becomes the language you use to make vows to who you would love. Village is where it echoes, takes on substance, makes consequence, means what it means. More mediation of love means less remediation of love. I mean, that's pretty good, Steve. I read that out too because this is something that actually is deeply counterintuitive is quite right, but the way that you're actually asking in matrimony from this understanding for the village or quote the would-be village or the possibility of village to actually mediate and be put to work alongside this thing in a way that, again, I've heard you speak about this, Steve, that a lot of weddings, and again, if you feel personally perhaps affronted by some of this conversation because of the way your wedding went down, as my first wedding did, and only so far, it more had this energy of what you might call a celebration of love, right? Just like we loved each other and we wanted to get married, and it's a beautiful thing, and that's a beautiful thing to do as well, and is that matrimony in the way that we're understanding as a chemical or forging event whereby the people in question become the occasion, but not the reason to gather. That there's something else at the center beyond the two particulars in question. And that's to me where it really becomes like something else, a deeper understanding of what's actually at stake when, you come for a good party and, that's great. But matrimony in the way that we're talking about it here is something else. It actually calls forth a way of becoming in service to the times. And so I think, again, I'd love to just draw that out a little bit more as well as this understanding of matrimony continues to open.
Right. Well, one of the things you're describing here, Ian, thanks for reading that out, by the way, too. I appreciate that to hear it. One of the things that's happening is that you're giving some kind of articulation to what we mean, not what we mean, what a ritual is.
Mhm.
A ritual is not what you decide it is, any more than, as you will find, that marriage is what you decide it is. Ritual is a God-endorsed proposition, or plural if you prefer, which I probably prefer it. God's endorsed proposition. And the endorsement is of what? We humans as we are, we don't need a ritual to be what we are. Rituals are a waste of time if your principal interest is re-entrenchment and reinforcement of what you've grown accustomed to and fond of and what you believe in. So ritual has simply other work to do, not more important work, although the argument probably could be made. But it's something like this. I mean, people don't invite me to their weddings. So I'm going on distance communication on the matter now. But once upon a time, I didn't seem that troubling. And I did attend some of these things. And the invitations were very telling. They tended to be kind of informal, or they were at war with formality. That was the first thing. Second thing is they were clearly at war with matrimony, as I will mean it in the next 3 or 4 sentences. They were attempting to redo or undo the lingering odor that seemed to accrue to all things marital. And the way it worked, the antidote that they found was to call it a celebration of love, which, as you said, Ian, is perfectly good, and we could use more of it. So this is not me trashing celebrations of love. It's just me saying they're not rituals. How can you say they're not rituals? Here's how. A celebration of love is an imprimatur sought and delivered upon something that already exists. The love, in this case. It's an acknowledgement of and a fortification of something that's already there. But you have no need to call down the mighty and the worthies and the ancients of days for anything more than thumbs up, if that's what you're on about. A ritual, as an alternative, is seeking alchemically to make something which is not yet and which may never be. That's the crapshoot of the matrimonial enterprise, is that you don't know if it's going to cash out. You don't know if it's going to land. You don't know if you've thought what you need to think about, and it's not a matter of whether things are coordinated, whether the things match, all of the, flurry of details that tend to draw our attention down in this matter. Who are you going to ask? Well, okay, I didn't invent the term and the two become one. And I'm not sure that it's the best kind of life advice, but maybe there are moments when the two becoming one is a thought to think, not a conviction to have. It's an enterprise to consider. And a ritual seems to be, among other things, there for us to reconsider our boundaries, our limits, our frailties, and to give them something to do, not to distract us from them, but to employ them instead. You could say that a fellow human being compromises your capacity for infinity, particularly in matters of romance. Could you say that again? Yes. In matters of romance in particular, the object of your affection is a compromise of your capacity for infinite consideration of the possibilities. They're a manifestation of a certain number of possibilities and really no more, as are you. So the alchemy that I'm describing now, is an alchemy that seeks to conjure something from the ether, a certain kind of humanity that, in spite of its deep infatuation with another human, is even willing for the infatuation to be transmuted into something that's world considering, not world dismissing. It's not you and me against the world, baby. It's not, I think we're alone now.
Mm. I thank you, Steve. And with this, like these moments, again, just to give folks too a sense of maybe like, so how does that, what kind of considerations then rise with this understanding? And what comes of this um, articulation you spoke of ritual is that, yeah, again, rituals can fail. Like there's a certain sense of, it's not just it'll happen because we decide. There's something at stake, and therefore, for example, at a gathering around matrimony is, and this is a true story in terms of happened to one fellow deep friend of mine who was, the orchestration of the wedding was by you, is that there had to be a consideration of who to invite, and it wasn't people that we liked and friends and family, and in a way, those were there too, but it actually became who can carry a ceremony because there's something really at stake here.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a very different consideration, right? Than, well, we want to maintain really, and it's all about relationships is good too. But that was the foundation of it. Can they carry this? Because there's something for real here. And hurt feelings, actually, which did transpire because of this, was one casualty of that,
Sure.
because it was really something was meant to happen. The other piece I just want to name too of these little moments, and again, I'm not saying this is the way the template of it per se, but at least that I encountered was that these particular matrimony undertakings, that moment or that shard where we often hear, at least perhaps in the West, at weddings, which is similar to, should anybody think these two should not be wed, speak now and forever hold your peace. At every other wedding I've been at, and by the way, I was a wedding DJ for about 10 years. Maybe not a surprise. So I saw a lot of weddings and I saw a lot of what happens and passes for weddings. And generally that moment, speak now or forever hold your peace, is a chuckled, okay, move on. Right. What happened at the weddings I was at for you is that particular moment was 3 to 4 hours.
Good memory. That's right.
Right. And again, because it was actually an invitation, not a formality that was just, just something to pass by, but it was really like that's where actually something was invited in to see if we could make something happen. Because I think so many couples, and maybe I'll read this one quote too to kind of bring this home, is that so many couples, I myself included at my wedding, are just so criminally bereft of the actual kind of guidance for what it is going to require to be married, like criminally under tutored, under mentored. And this is the reason I think what you're speaking to, because there's not a wider stewardship of this very thing. And so one of the consequences of that, when it's maybe a celebration of love or something where there's not really a binding sense of true responsibility to not just the ceremony itself, of course, but everything after, is that here, you say this again in your book. We're asking too much of the nuclear couple version of matrimony. We're now left with, when we ask it to cover, well, one, the absence of patrimony, which we haven't touched on yet, but the same way we ask too much of the nuclear family when we ask it to fill in for the absence of a living, tradition-bearing community or village. And I think many folks may recognize that, is that without that binding sense of force and true responsibility to carry this thing, both then and after, that the nuclear family is just, again, deeply bereft to contend with all of the ways in which life has its way with us, and the thresholds and the births and the deaths and everything. And that mark of matrimony, as I understand that you've spoken to, is that it's actually meant to be part of that weaving together, right? Through hoisting up of something meaningful, through true forging of something of, again, back to this question of what is culture. So I just wanted to add that too, for folks that are, again, wondering how this translates into that. And yeah, what might serve for either of you, Kimberly or Stephen?
Well, let me jump and say the obligation to, quote, translate this into what does it look like practically is wildly premature and uncalled for. It's not that it's not understandable, but man, if you want to figure out how to make it right, and you're a citizen of the West that was born in the last 80 or so years, I think you have an obligation to begin with the poverties of the times and how did it get like it is. Because the failure to begin inclusively with that, it almost guarantees that the solutions that you will generate will replicate the troubles and the poverties, unawares for the most part, but generally speaking. How do you find out how ceremonially bereft you actually are? Not personally. That's the nature of your inheritance, not your character. Here's how. I don't know if you can see it. We're sitting here. No, you can't quite get it in the camera. Okay, so this is a beautifully woven serape from Mexico, about 80 or 90 years old. I've got a material problem. I like woven things a lot. I mean, not all of them, but when they're beautiful, they knock me out. And some of you who have this problem know exactly where the story is going.
Mhm.
How do you find out? So, okay, so marriages come around. In the old days, I was outfitting a lot of them. And so I would proceed through my life as if I was inevitably going to become a kind of ceremonial department store owner for a little while. And so I would stockpile these beautiful things with the possibility that they'd be called on someday. How do you find out how well you've taken care of the stuff that's come to you? The day comes when you're going to give it away. And so with great sense of purpose and moment, you take them from the closet only to discover, I can't show you one here, but I can put my finger through it, that the moths have been at it. And that's what I'm talking about. That's how you, and when you find out that it can't hold, doesn't matter how you feel about the other person and about your place in life, certain things can't hold. If you can't begin with, it's not working, the chances of you being able to figure out what working actually means, not that favorable. But you were going to say? No.
Hmm. Kimberly, yeah, I might ask you. So again, you've experienced matrimonial orchestration like this or encounter like this, and I just wonder if you might speak to what that was like and maybe what the consequence has been in terms of trying to proceed in such a way.
Sure. But what I'm sensing is that for some reason also there's a difference between saying matrimony is important and everybody should get married. Those are two
Hmm.
separate things. There's also a difference between saying the way that you know matrimony occurs is if marriage lasts. Is a marriage lasting? Is that the sign of if matrimony occurred? How do we know if matrimony occurred? So it seems to be, because I can feel it in the space here, even though it's a virtual space, that because tradition nowadays is just so contentious, and part of the village that Tamara is a response to like the formation of structures to this point haven't worked, governments to this point haven't worked, and so here's an attempt at a new kind of self-governance and a new kind of village mindedness. And we're just so trained into either or thinking. Stephen and I circling around matrimony, which we haven't done for quite some time. So we're like dusting it off a little bit here. We did a series about this a year ago, and I'm writing the foreword to the book. So we've been on and off in it. Is really about, I have a 17-year-old daughter. I work with a lot of people who are parents and their children aren't doing well, and they're confused about why their children are still adolescents into their 20s and 30s. And what Stephen's work does is it casts a very wide lens. So you have to learn how to listen and not jump to conclusions about what each of the principles that we're talking about are. So there's so much, it's sort of like sex. There's just so much attached to the one word. There's so much attached to marriage that everything just collapses in on it. It becomes marriage equals divorce equals marriage, matrimony equals wedding equals I don't want anything to do with the state in my life. I don't want a prenup. I don't want the financial obligations. I don't want to have to deal with, like, if I'm going to get divorced anyways, I don't want to deal with joining everything to then have to take it all apart again. And I don't feel that I'm making any kind of argument for the benefits of getting married, because what do I know about it? I've been married for a year and a half. But what we're talking about is exactly what you mentioned about invitations. There's so many different ways. When I was, the main message you get when you're getting married is this is about you. This is your day. You're the bride. It's your day. Just you got to feel as good as possible on that day. That's the message. This is your time. So you invite who you want. Don't conflict. You definitely wouldn't want conflict at your wedding. So let's try to avoid that at all costs. Even things like, should we have alcohol? Well, my dad's in AA, and yeah, but it's festive, but then people behave badly with alcohol, and all of these things that become like, oh, bridezilla, or get the wedding planner and like outsource to pay somebody else to address these things, are all part of what's creating so much angst, so much uncertainty, so much lack of groundedness and sense of belonging. Belonging is the hottest word out there. You tell community and belonging. You sell something and you say that people will feel a sense of belonging, and it's like they don't even know what they're buying. They just want to belong somewhere. Well, why do we want to belong somewhere so bad? Because we can't lean back and count on anything. Like most of us is like every holiday is also a do-it-yourself holiday. Tree, no tree, presents, no presents, church 24th, maybe not. So this is really just an opportunity. Do I want matrimony in the world? I do, personally. It's happened, marriages happen anyway. Mm-hmm.
Good choice of words. I do.
Thanks.
Sorry.
But what we're talking about are what opportunities do we have that exist that are culture making propositions.
Mm-hmm.
And the book, this new book, which comes out in August 12th with Sounds True, available for pre-order, but the cover is not on Amazon yet.
You're shameless. You're shameless.
Yeah, but I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for you.
Okay. Good.
I didn't write the book. So the book, it requires a lot. It's hard reading. It doesn't.
You're not going to put that in the preface, are you? In the intro?
I'm going to be like, get a drink.
This is
sit
barely
down.
worth the trouble.
You're going to need a nap after every paragraph. No, I'm not going to put that in.
Okay.
There's a lot of well-worn grooves, it seems to me, about people we already think we know climate change. This is what contributes to it, carbon, This is really an opportunity to understand grief also from a different perspective. Because if matrimony is like death, there's grief there. So it's not just celebration, happy. It's also, wow, my family, how it's been, in my case, me and my daughter, we're no longer two. The two is going to be three, and that's going to be radically different. And it's going to require something of all of us differently. And for me and my daughter, there is a lot of sadness there, even though we were also very excited, but it was a letting go of a configuration that would be no more, and we would never get back. It would never be how it was. So as you said, this proposition of the village of lovers and some people not understanding, like, well, what would a conversation about matrimony have anything to do with a community that is more about less parameters in relating, more communication probably, but less parameters around things like monogamy. This is really a much wider discussion about places and spaces where also things like generational knowledge could come to bear on it. Right? Part of why is it so confusing when you're about to get married and you don't know who should be? I mean, just a couple hundred years ago, if you were going to a wedding, and I'm not saying matrimony was always happening then either, but you would at least know what to expect. You'd know what to wear. You'd know, probably what kind of a gift to bring. I was going to go to a funeral a bit ago, and it wasn't a funeral, it was a celebration of life, which is interesting, right? So a marriage and a wedding kind of have the same, they're both celebrations now.
Do they ever?
And so I was going to go to this funeral and I got dressed. And then on my way there, I called the person who was also going, like, oh my God, like, what are you wearing? Are people wearing black? And it was like, no, people aren't wearing black. They're wearing like party colors. So like I had to go back home and get dressed again to show up so that I was in alignment with what else was happening there. And I think that these things have a cumulative pileup that live in our unconscious and then get labeled depression or anxiety or all different kinds of labels, when in fact it's the cultural bereftness and the absence of space for grief and the absence of when you're talking about, does anybody object to this? Really, that's just inviting the whole picture into the event instead of only deciding that it's one thing, because that's pretty bad marriage preparation to only celebrate everything that's good, because we know that being married is hard, not all the time, but some of the time. So if the ceremony itself has no space for anything that could go wrong or that is challenging, you're not really getting good preparation for how you're going to proceed. In my case, for instance, we beaded for like, I only have one left, but we had two, everybody there had two necklaces. My husband practices candomblé. So the white is for Oshala and the gold is for Oshun. And then the other necklace was gold with a white bead. And our plan was that they were going to be on everyone's tables when they came in. And everyone wanted me to make the arrangements for the seating arrangements. So I spent all this time deciding who I thought should sit where and who. And I was kind of excited. I want these people to meet these people and everything. And then I wasn't there for the first half of the wedding because it wasn't my turn to come in. It wasn't my rhythm to come in on. So I didn't even know what was happening. But when I did come in, the bees were nowhere to be seen and nobody was sitting where I had assigned them. So on one hand, I'm thinking I wasted so much time doing these seating charts. And on the other hand, I was thinking, where are the beads? Like, I mean, everybody was beading. My mom was beading, but because we had so many beads, not everybody was closing them. Only a ceremonialist closed them, but beading the strands, everyone's doing. So it was after the ceremony that I leaned over to my husband, like, where are the beads? He's like, I don't know where the beads are. So in the end, we did find them. And then the next day we had a different kind of a celebration. We walked around and we gave every person their beads if they wanted them and put them on their neck. So it became something totally different where we spent the next day adorning people with the beads and having a chance to make eye contact with each person. So they could have been lost and that could have been a different story. But in this story, the way that we had planned it changed because we had to rely on so many people to be delivering things from certain places. The pottery that we had made for the ceremony could break really easily. So it had to come on a boat instead of a car and then get transported from one place to another. The day after the wedding was no kind of honeymoon. It was like, we looked around, our entire hotel room was covered in pottery that was drying because we had dried all the plates that people hadn't taken. And we're just looking at each other like, now what do we do with all this? Because it wasn't disposable. It wasn't these were things that mattered, that people that we loved had eaten on, and we needed to find a way to transport them in a way that they would not break transporting them. So we still had so much work to do for a long time after the day of the wedding. It wasn't like we arrived, we are the king and the queen or the prince and the princess, and then we left, because we were still village making even after that ceremony was over, trying to show people around where my husband's from and make sure that my parents were comfortable and all those other things. So when people say, was it the best day of your life? It's just, that's a weird question, but it was a different kind of a day where I was engaged on many different levels. Something was required of me that hadn't been required before. And it wasn't, I was under its spell. I wasn't in control of the spell making. So I was subject to the conjuring.
Thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, Steve, we got about 10 or so minutes, I think, of our time. I mean, if folks have some particular questions as well that you're curious about, to drop in the chat. We won't invite folks on, but we can kind of bring them and harvest them from there. But yeah, Steve, before maybe I insert something else, but I wonder, yeah, what stirs for you in hearing all that?
Well, how about this? Why is it called matrimony? How's that different from wedding? How's it different from marriage? How's it different from romance? These things are not beads on a string. You know, you start with one, you more or less inevitably plow through the possibilities to get to the next one, and so on down the line. Matrimony is a very specific word with a very specific range of endeavor attached to it. And I'm not making this up, just in case people are curious on that matter. You can do the etymological investigation on your own. You may discover or find a way to come to grips with the following. So the suffix moni is, I'm going to generalize and say it means something in the order of the repertoire by which, or the tracks and traces by which you can know that this is so. The evidence, the signs, the trailings, you get the idea. And then the root word is mother, not wife, not girlfriend, not partner, God help us, mother. How is the word mother appearing in a traditional conjuring event where the motherhood in question precedes, typically or etiquette-wise, precedes conception? Why is it called mothering? The repertoire of mothering? Because it's not talking about human procreation, that's why. Because the work of matrimony is the work of mothering a culture into existence, and then into reformation, and then into reconstitution. It's the repertoire of cultural motherhood. And that means that it's not the exclusive purview of women with a womb. It's the work of people whose responsibility is to the wider world. And the repertoire is available on a number of bases to all the walking wounded who pass for citizens. It's citizenship labor. That's what matrimony is. Patrimony, no less so, although it's a word that never appeared, unless I insisted that it did, in any of the reckonings that I did back and forth across the realm of possibility as we reconstituted the weddings in the name of matrimony. So I thought that was maybe missing a little bit in the discussion so far. I know there's a few other things that are, but it's important to recognize that this is the word itself is not incidental to the enterprise. The enterprise is procreative culturally. It's the repertoire of culture redemption. So there's an awful lot hanging on those 15-minute events where it seems to me they're principally orchestrated to make sure that nothing much happens. Because it's already happened, you see.
Mm-hmm.
That being the celebration of love. But if you're about trying to reconstitute from the witherings of a broken culture, you may be willing to consider the possibility that we're failing on that enterprise 2 by 2 on most Saturday afternoons around the corner from where you live.
Mm. Thanks, Stephen. What strikes me is I've heard you speak about this too, and in many ways we've sort of spiraled our way back to the beginning of the talk around the culture or the function of culture and understanding of culture, where it may differ from folks' understanding coming in. And the way that you've spoken about it, and then I've been moved by, is this idea that culture, one, is an achievement, that it's something actually that is to be achieved, and that therefore is requires actually a ongoing willingness and a skillfulness in order to achieve culture. And that for I've heard you spoke about how what passes for culture often in the dominant culture, let's call it, is not so much a culture but an anti-culture. In fact, it's something that eats other cultures in a sort of ominous way, but also a very real way. It kind of draws in anything that has any kind of real sense of life-sustaining authenticity, per se, and kind of draws into it and then, commodifies it and spits it back. And so in many ways, not many folks, I think, may have, depending on where they grew up or cultures they're attached to, may have that understanding that culture itself is an achievement. And therefore, matrimony can be that possibility, that forge of culture making. And maybe I'd just be curious for you to speak to that as well. So therefore, how are the times served by the willingness to make culture from that understanding in the ways in which life is asking us? I mean, maybe in my words, but I'd be curious to hear your take.
This is going to sound unnecessarily brief and limited because of that. But here goes. You're wild about somebody, Ian, let's say. I know you've been wild about people. I was there, right? Myself included, Kimberly included, Natalie's on the other side of the camera included. We know what we mean when I say you've been wild about somebody. It's a strange turn of phrase, you got to admit, that suddenly it's wilderness time. Well, it is, isn't it? The great mystery, which is another person, is a kind of wilderness time, right? And the last thing you should be about is trying to demote the wilderness until it's another version, a more spicy version of what you already know. So I would say that matrimony is there to give the depth and intensity and volcanicity of your feelings for someone, a place to appear in the world that doesn't require that someone to sit still all the time to be on the receiving end of how you feel about them. You could say it differently in this way. Let's imagine your sense of well-being is enhanced because you're properly in love. You're deeply, achievedly in love. Your sense of well-being blossoms in a way that was inconceivable to you as long as you're humming along on all independent and sovereign cylinders. Okay? I'm suggesting that the world just immediately around you, the material world, the non-human world, the human world, the other world, if you will, all of those things should be fed by the benefit that has come to you as a result of your tremendous escapade called being in love. That's what matrimony is there to do, to translate the epic beauty available to you in ways that other people, unbeknownst to them, take into themselves. And it's not specific only to the wedding proper. But that's why you're called what you're called at a wedding. You're not called the audience, at least not in my hearing yet. That hasn't happened yet. But you are called witnesses. Witnesses are people who carry the testimony of what happened. That's what witnesses are asked to do, to carry the deep, truing event that they've been in on out beyond the realm of human memory, as the two people, when the specialness of the day passes as it must, and they have to find a way to make peace with the diminishment of the specialness and plow it back into the ordinariness of days. The witnesses are there to remind you that doing so is not second best.
Thank you, Steve. I think this follows actually this question that was offered in the comments, actually, and I'd love to read it out. And this could actually get us to near completion, but it's got some heft to it, as it sounds like someone who's been to the farm and has been around some of these ways. If I say this right, Leica is the name. But they say, Stephen, I once heard you speak about matrimony on the farm. You were talking about counseling a couple and telling them to let the wind blow through it. At the time, I took it to mean that you were suggesting that they open every door in their heart, every door in their life, to allow for the wind, maybe the breath of the gods, to clear them out in order to temper their desire to bind their lives to one another. If you're willing, could you share a little bit about your own journey marrying Natalie, of the guidance you had or were lacking, of the counsel you might have sought? Could you perhaps speak a bit of returning to and dwelling at the hearth of matrimony many years down the road, post-wedding ceremony? Just a little more. It seems that many in our culture are in poverty, not just in the ceremony of marriage itself, but in the ability to return to the union over and over again, even when it perhaps seemed to be not serving you, as it often the preoccupation in Western culture. What do you think? Do you want me to read any other line back at you? Or do you have enough to go on?
Oh, I think the gist of it was, okay, wise guy, what did you do? I mean, there's more to it, of course, but well, fair enough. But I didn't offer myself up as a particularly cogent example of anything I'm talking about. So let's put that out there first. Second of all, I don't have a real exotic tale to tell, largely because I've often used the term shard, S-H-A-R-D, to describe these notions that have come to me over the years as I've thought more and more about matrimony and from whence it comes and to what purpose and what's become of it and so on. These things that are available, not just to me, but as they occurred to me, were kind of evidence of a once upon a time intact vessel of a kind of chalice, if you will. And you don't get to reconstitute, I mean, as close as you get, IKEA cup. And so you don't get a chance for the glorious possibility that the various shards whisper to you first time out or last time out. And then I knew enough to know that I had to submit myself, even though I had all the notions of how this should go. But at the end of the day, we had to put ourselves in the hands of somebody else. And they were going to do with the matrimony what they were going to do. Because I didn't have anybody to orchestrate the year preparation and all the rest at the time. I don't know if I were to undertake it now, if that would be, wholly different. But I'm glad we did. The good news was that when the elder who was conducting the affair, I was going to call it, maybe not the best choice of words, the event, when she got out of the truck or the vehicle that was bringing her to the site, which was at our farm, she looked around, she said, "Oh, this is going to be fine," which was a nice relief to hear. "Why do you say that?" I said to her. She said, "This looks exactly like it did when I was a kid." She was in her 60s or so by that time. So we kind of were strangely, unexpectedly onto something that was recognizable to a 60-year-old woman who'd who'd ridden the ritual rails, let's say, and was deeply, clearly skilled. And of course, as is proper, the rest is a blur. I have photographs, but none of them look like what happened to me. And yes, it's fair to say that the people who were there at the time have gone in the way of all flesh in my life, as I have probably done in theirs. Because the point is not to reconstitute over and over again the wedding receptacle and call of that a memory. I think the work is to recast and reconstitute what came to you in ways that seem called for now, and register the changes in life that are making their claim upon you, which I'm very much in the throes of now. So as given my age, 70, given the certain circumstances that have shifted around, I have a certain kind of matrimonial obligation that bears no resemblance to the guy who got married some, whatever it is, 25 years ago. And that act of translating is an old man's act now. The rest is my business.
Thanks, Stephen.
Welcome.
You know, as we've spoken about this matrimony as a path or in service to cultural regeneration or to village mindedness, village making. And that's so much of what at least I've been able to be nourished by. I mean, what you and Natalie conjured on the farm, the way you hosted folks, the way you gathered, the way you brought us into the practice and skillfulness of all of these matters in ways that sustain all that which sustains us. Like that is the very thing I think we're speaking to, that the matrimonial forge could be that matrimony becomes the place where village is able to gather again in different ways and to begin to remember these things. And
sorry, Ian, to interrupt you, but that's,
sure.
I realize now that the making of the school followed upon what I just described. It wasn't there before. I think the school was literally a child of the matrimonial enterprise.
Yeah.
It just occurred, I have never thought that thought before, and it seems like an obvious thing to say, but so I thought I should say it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Exactly that. Yeah, that suddenly there was the idea, the conjuring, the possibility of the school emerging, budding from from true matrimony. And so I certainly benefited from it. A lot of folks have as well. But I wonder as we wind our way down in this conversation. Yeah, I know, Kimberly, if there's anything you want to speak to offer before we close out. We're about 90 minutes almost here, so don't want to ask too much. But yeah, maybe Kimberly and then Stephen once again, and then we'll find our way to this etiquette of ending.
There's nothing remaining for me right now. Yeah.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Well, it's good of you to have asked, not just the last question, but all the questions, you know. And it's good to try to remember on our behalf of the two of us that we're, you know, living this as a way of trying to figure it out. Not delivering the goods, but, you know, because our translation of matrimony, each unto our own endeavors, involves a lot of other people. It doesn't involve principally how we think about ourselves, how we feel about this notion, the book, or anything of the kind. And because it involves other people, it should be undertaken with a degree of regard for the calamitous possibilities, you know. And calamitous possibilities doesn't mean stuff that's not supposed to happen. It means, you know, the God of matrimony is on par with the God of death. It's that vast, and it has its own repertoire, its own etiquette, its own language that you learn or fail to at your peril. You learn the language of death in order to be able to die. You learn the language of matrimony in order to be able to be recast, mothered by the culture that seems to be, quote, for the moment, failing you. That's the reversal I'd introduce. Rather than imagining yourself, sucking on the hind tit of matrimony and calling that the way it should be, you could imagine to be matrimony's principal servant, one fitful incarnation at a time.
Well, once again, the book in question, the book forthcoming around these matters, Matrimony, Ritual, Culture, and the Heart's Work. Could you just say when it will be published as well?
It'll be August 12th, 2025.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And for folks that are registered, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll send you the links to both of your work to people to follow up as well in all the offerings you've offered or created over the years, and more to come as well. I know, speaking of death, there's a 10-year event on Diewise also coming in the year or within the short near term. So once again, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Kimberly. Appreciate willingness to sit and tune in with us. Yeah. And to everyone as well, the Fugitive Futures full gathering occurs in just under 48 hours as we launch into a 5-day journey. So thank you so much for this approach, and onward we go.